Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and this episode will mark the start of a new series on Gemstone Mine, Hot Brews, where we'll be talking with some of the people who are brewing some of the most innovative and hottest decks in the cEDH metagame. If you ever thought about giving cEDH a try, but just thought that it was a bunch of Grixis decks trying to turbo out a win on turn 1, or you never really found a list that spoke with you, maybe some of these will inspire you to come up with a brew of your own, or just give cEDH a shot in general. And of course, it wouldn't be an episode of Gemstone Mine without some useful lessons from cEDH to take away for your own deck building and gameplay. But before we get started, as promised, Gemstone Mine is now a part of CCO Media Group, which in my head will just always be pronounced CCOMG! And we are now sponsored by Fusion Gaming Online, your source for all your gaming needs. Did you happen to see those singles that I got for my Galta deck over the holidays? If not, go check out that Humility episode. It was a ton of fun. For me, not for anybody else. That's just the way Stacks works. But the short version is that I saved a ton of money when I used the promo code CCO Perks to get 10% back in store credit. And the next time I go, I'll use CCO Summer to save an additional 5%. I mean, Ravnica Remastered is dropping in the next couple of weeks, and that means Shocklands are going to be reprinted, and that means it's probably a good time to pick up some more Shocklands for my own collection. So, I'm going to use the promo code CCO Summer to save 5% on my order. And they'll get them all the way from Canada down to me in the good old US of A, because yes, they do ship international. That's Fusion Gaming Online, your source for all your gaming needs. With the new group, that does mean our schedule is going to change a little bit from what it was in previous years. Importantly, we're still going to have new episodes out roughly every other week, and then in between those new episodes, we're going to port over some of the old back catalog of Gemstone Mine. And if you guys have any of your favorites that we did in previous years, let me know about it down in the comments, so that way we can make sure we bring only the primo stuff over first for the CCO people who haven't really gotten to see all the best stuff quite yet. This month, our new episodes are going to be all about Temur, that is blue, red, green, because our first episode of Hot Brews has an absolutely scorching hot take on Temur and cEDH that I promise you is like nothing you have ever seen before. So, let's click it over to the interview. That wasn't it. Maybe this one? There it is. And I am delighted to introduce our first guest on Hot Brews, Cobblepot. Welcome.
Hey, good to be here.
So, Cobblepot, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get digging into this very interesting deck that you brought over. Where might people know you from? How do we address you?
You can find me at Twitter, at Reddit, and on YouTube a little bit, but everything at Cobblepot, and you should be able to find me. But I have been a member of the cEDH community since before it was called cEDH. I was a member of the Laboratory Maniacs and am a current member of the Sculptibois, and I have, I think, kind of carved out a niche in the community as far as brewing in the fringe and finding things that are often something that in and of themselves don't wind up necessarily becoming, a staple or a mainstay of the format, but wind up giving other people ideas that they then pick up and convert into actual, tournament all-stars. So I have enjoyed a bit of notoriety in that case as far as coming up with odd stuff and people looking at me kind of funny, and then other people saying, wait a minute, I've enjoyed being in that position quite a bit.
You can find some really interesting things trying to explore the spaces that are underexplored in just about any metagame and any format. I first found out about cEDH from Laboratory Maniacs videos. I gotta say, the work you did with Laboratory Maniacs is something that made me a cEDH player today.
Well, I'm glad. That's really cool to make those connections because there's a lot in our community. The cEDH community started really small, and there's a lot of like networking and just interconnections that a lot of I'll say boomers, the cEDH boomers kind of had, and it's really cool to see how those kind of compound and kind of spiral outward, and it's just really cool to see how how much cEDH has grown and where it's gone in the past, say, 6 years. It's really quite incredible.
Absolutely. Cobblepot, when I suggested this as a topic for our episode, you suggested that one brew you were very excited to talk about has the rather unique name of Clown Car.
Yes. Clown Car is a Krark Thrasios brew. It has a lot of kind of similar lines that you would expect from Krark Sakashima, but the addition of green gives it a whole lot of different kind of capabilities that are absent from kind of the stock Is-It lists. The name comes from the to battlefield tutors that you have in Neoform, Port of Calling, Finale, Edge Evolution, all those sorts of things, where the idea is that when you cast one of those spells, if instead of just having one of those spells on the stack, you can put two of them on the stack. You find some way to make that happen. You resolve the top one and bring in something that allows you to interact with the remaining one that's on the stack to keep on going. So normally when you, let's say you neoform your Thrasios, people are expecting that, oh, you're going to go and find a creature that's 3 CMC, and then you'll do something from there. When you wind up actually resolving it, and your first neoform goes off, and you go and get Dualcaster Mage that then copies the neoform again, and then you resolve that, and then you go and get Sigil Tracer, and then tap the Sigil Tracer and the Dualcaster to copy the neoform, and then you go and get Spellseeker, and it finds Essence Flux, and then you flicker the Dualcaster, and then you make another copy, and you wind up chaining through all of the creatures that are 3 CMC in your deck, and you wind up establishing a board presence from what people expected, this one spell. You've kind of, people keep on coming out of it, and it winds up taking people aback because they might not have evaluated it or assessed the threat of it to be like, this is going to win the game right now. And it's got a lot of really kind of clever and innovative things that you can do off of those kinds of premises. So it's a really interesting concept, and it's very easy to assemble, and it's very easy to execute.
Okay, so why don't we first start by talking about the commanders? I know a lot of folks in the more casual end of the commander metagame are going to look at Krark as just kind of one of the fun, interesting, goofy coin flip commanders that's double or nothing. And they may have heard that Krark is a really strong cEDH deck. But do you think you can explain briefly how Krark earned that reputation? How does the math actually play out that makes Krark part of this strategy that you're describing?
The thing about Krark and about copies is that Krark by himself is not very good, because basically he just makes everything 50-50. Either you double it or it goes back to your hand. The thing that makes Krark good, and the reason why he is generally paired up with Sakashima, is that if you can get multiple Krark triggers, then the number of triggers is roughly proportional. The outcome that you can expect to get improving. So let's say that you have one Krark. You flip one coin, you're going to get a 50-50 chance that you have favorable outcome, as in you get 2 copies, 50% unfavorable, and it bounces back to your hand. If you have 2 Krarks, then what will happen is there's 2 flips, in which case in one of them you copy twice, in one of them you copy once and bounce back, in the other one you copy once and bounce back, and in the last case both of them bounce back and you don't get any copies. So when Krark is just by himself, it's a 50-50. When you have 2 triggers, it's 75% chance of a favorable outcome. And then when you go to 3 Krarks, then it's an 87.5% favorable outcome, which means that you can basically cast anything, any instant or sorcery, and it's as if it has buyback 0. So you cast the spell and likely get a copy that actually implements the effect of that spell, and then also get that spell back to your hand. And when you put that on Ritual, then it's very simple to theoretically go infinite mana. The thing about Thrasios with Krark, as opposed to Sakashima, is that Krark and Sakashima need to make a balance between the generation of mana and card advantage. Because Thrasios is in the command zone, we can put a disparate amount of focus on generating mana because we can pump mana into Thrasios for that card advantage. So instead of having kind of a tenuous balance that could be in question, we can load up on things that just generate tons of mana, and then if we get there, then we know that we'll be able to be on our game plan. So it can be more consistent in that way. Does this make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. It just allows you to spend more slots in your deck on that single redundant effect, rather than hoping you draw the perfect blend out of your deck. You're probably just fine with any of the redundant effects to get that potential line going.
That's right. Someone might then say, well, wait a minute, since you don't have Sakashima, then how is it that you're getting multiple triggers from Krark? Really, the thing that makes Krark go is not so much Sakashima. It's more Harmonic Prodigy and Veyran, Voice of Duality. The Prodigy and Veyran both, they do is they see instants and sorceries cast, and if those casting actions cause triggers to take place, then they just add an additional trigger. So that is effectually like having 2 Krarks on the battlefield, but they're independent. A common way to disrupt Krark Sakashima is when Sakashima's on the stack, then you kill Krark. And then when Sakashima comes into play, now it's got nothing to copy. In the case of Harmonic Prodigy or Veyran, they're completely independent, and it doesn't matter which one comes on the battlefield first. And Harmonic Prodigy and Veyran don't just amplify Krark, they'll amplify everything that you have in the deck, because essentially everything here is wizards and shamans, with a couple of notable exceptions, but they'll amplify everything and Krark. So you wind up getting a really, really potent set of capabilities that, somebody's got a Drannith Magistrate. You know what? Harmonic Prodigy plus Dualcaster Mage and Eternal Witness and Displacer Kitten, that's still going to win you the game. You don't need Krark on the battlefield. So there's just, it's almost like every creature in the deck is a must interact with threat. So instead of just, when this deck gets this card out, everybody needs to make sure that they interact with it. It's like, all right, don't let this deck get Dockside onto the battlefield, and don't let it get Harmonic Prodigy, and Tavern Scoundrel, and Bergie, and Dualcaster, and it's like everything that's there is something that could threaten to just win the game on the spot, given the right circumstances.
So how would this compare then to other Temur decks? For example, one of the things you brought up when we were hashing out the idea for this episode was the relationship to another deck that had some success in cEDH for a little while with Kalamax.
Yeah, Kalamax, if you're not familiar, and I don't blame you if you're not, it's a Temur commander that has your first instant or sorcery that you cast each turn, and I think Calamax has to be tapped. It'll get copied. So what people would do is they would cast Chord of Calling on somebody else's turn, and they would get 2 copies of it, and then they would go and get Dualcaster Mage. And I don't think they used Sigil Tracer. They would do some other lines. I like Sigil Tracer just because Krark and Thrasios and just about every other creature in the deck is a wizard. So you're able to do a lot of really interesting things through Sigil's mechanic.
Why don't we actually read Sigil Tracer here? Because I know that is one that I recall from some of the Hulk days. But Sigil Tracer is not exactly a common card in a lot of different tables. So Sigil Tracer is 1 blue for a 2/2 creature merfolk wizard with 1 and a blue, comma, tap 2 untapped wizards you control, colon. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. I had to emphasize where the punctuation was with that, because as we all know, all the parts of a cost that come before the colon are parts of the cost, which means they don't use the stack and can't be interacted with. So for a low cost of 1 and a blue and tap 2 untapped wizards, one of which can be Sigil Tracer.
And there's no tap symbol. So this is, the creature comes onto the battlefield and then can immediately be used in this activation to be able to copy whatever spell. One of the things with Krark is, let's say you do have Krark on the battlefield and you don't have Harmonic Prodigy or Valen. Now Krark is a liability because anything you cast, it has a 50-50 chance of just doing nothing and coming back to your hand. What Sigil Tracer and Dualcaster, both in their own different ways, allow you to do is to kind of circumvent that, where you cast something and then hold priority and put a copy of it on the stack above the Krark trigger. And then you know for sure that you're going to get at least 1 copy of that spell to actually go. And it also winds up creating a lot of interesting dynamics with counter magic, because kind of the according to Hoyle best practice is when somebody casts a spell with Krark on the battlefield, the spell goes on the stack, and then you have however many Krark triggers that go on above it. And what you do is you counter the original spell on the stack as soon as possible, so that it can't get bounced back to hand and then reused on the same stack. What Sigil Tracer lets you do is it kind of acts sort of like counter magic, because you put a spell on the stack and then somebody says, oh, I'm going to counter it. And if you don't have any counters in hand, you can just tap 2 your wizards and then copy your spell above their counter magic on the stack. And now they have to counter the spell again. For as many wizards that you happen to have, which by nature of how this deck works, oftentimes is a lot, you're able to go pretty deep in just kind of sidestepping counter magic on the stack. And then once you get really anything to resolve, especially, any of the Neoform kind of spells, then you just snowball and there's not really anything anybody can do.
So that's a really interesting approach with Sigil Tracer. It's not apparent that you can essentially use Sigil Tracer's ability as a pseudo-offensive counterspell, trying to defend your own game plan while it's still on the stack.
So it's one of those things, and we'll talk about functional fixedness either now or later on, but there's a lot of ways that people expect certain cards to be used. So for example, Sigil Tracer says, target spell. It doesn't say target spell you control. So also what you can do is just kind of stick them on the battlefield, and then somebody casts a demonic tutor or an ad nauseum or any other spell that is something that would be beneficial if you just happened to get a copy of it without needing to cast anything. That it winds up being a parasitic, opportunistic kind of line of play, where people need to be aware that anything they cast can be kind of poached and taken from them. And something that another dynamic to this is if there's a stacks player, then there's a rule of law. things like Dualcaster and Sigil Tracer are not looking for things being cast. So Sigil Tracer most of the time is the way that you interact through rule of law. If somebody either tries to interact or you do something and they want to interact with you, you just put another copy of it, and now nobody can interact because of the rule of law. So there's a lot of dynamics in play, and it winds up being just very rich in the different kind of directions that you can go if you're willing to kind of think outside of kind of the rote use cases that most people kind of presume.
I think now is just a good time to talk about that. You mentioned functional fixedness, and only reason I know anything about it was that it came up in a college lecture once. So why don't we just cover that now, and then we can dive back into more of the depth that's still present in this deck list. So what is functional fixedness?
Functional fixedness is a mental bias that leads people to, when they're using a resource that has a purpose or that has a use, the use case that they have learned for it is its only use case, and that it's functionally fixed. So, for instance, Dualcaster. People who play Dualcaster often play Twin Flame because they combo together, and what they'll do is they'll hang on to Dualcaster for multiple turns, waiting to find Twin Flame. And people are casting tutors, and people are casting interesting disruption and removal spells. And all this time, they can be casting their Dualcaster to double up on somebody's interaction, maybe to win a counter war, or to grab a tutor for themselves to grab something that they need. And they're not doing that because they're focused on waiting for that Twin Flame, because that's what Dualcaster is for. And that mindset is why there's lots of cards that don't often see play in cEDH, because people don't think of the ways that they can be useful outside of kind of the pedestrian, most well-trod direction.
So do you have any tips for anybody who is trying to look at their own deck list and trying to find areas where they may be limiting themselves with that functional fixedness?
It's a thing you have to be very intentional about, like crop rotation, for instance. It's very easy to look at crop rotation and say, well, this is my way that I get Gaia's Cradle, and it's the way that I get my Emergent Zone, because those are very good uses for it. But what else could it be used for? Maybe you're playing one of those decks that uses the new Nissa and Lotus Cobra. Maybe you have Nissa and Lotus Cobra both on the battlefield at the same time, so every land creates 2 mana for you. Maybe you do a crop rotation for a fetch land because you actually want to generate more mana than any one single land could get you, and you want it to be multiple colors. So I'm going to crop rotate this land that I have, go and get a fetch land. It enters the battlefield and gives me 2 mana of whatever colors I want, and then I crack it and go get another land that then gives me 2 more mana, and then I can tap that land for mana, and all of a sudden I've pulled 5 mana of arbitrary colors to be able to do what I want, rather than what people would have expected to, go and get a Gaia's Cradle or something like that. And I guess the only way to kind of foster that is to look at the cards that you have and say, why do I have this? What's this for? And then after you've kind of established what it's for, challenge that and say, okay, is that all that it's for? What else could it do? So when you're looking at Eternal Witness is going to be good at interacting with Displacer Kitten and reusing things like LED, but it's a shaman, so it's going to interact well with Harmonic Prodigy because it'll double up, and it can allow you to reset the clown card, for instance. So you did your Neo form and you sacrifice Thrasios, so you can only get things that are 3 CMC. And maybe you want to go and get something that's 4 or something that's 2. You can have your Ewit come onto the battlefield as part of the resolution of the last copy, and then bring Neoform back to your hand and then cast it again. It's just thinking about, how can I use this? What are people expecting me to do with this card? And what can I do that might not be expected? And for a lot of cards, okay, there's not going to be something unexpected you can do with, counterspell. But there's a lot of cards that have a lot of very interesting use cases, like Dragon's Rage Channel, that maybe people aren't considering and realizing that, oh wow, this is something that can be very, very useful. So it's a habit that I just kind of have always. It's just kind of how I'm wired. I think about things in weird ways, I guess. But challenging kind of the establishment is something that is always good in Magic and in life.
Another thing that I found just somewhat helpful before we get off the topic of functional fixedness is when you only have a single tool to use, it can be, on one hand, easy to just imagine the single use case scenario. But when it is the only option that exists for you, sometimes trying to look at all the potential options you have for that tool is what unlocks some of that or breaks down some of that functional fixedness. So if you're sitting there back in the early days of modern cEDH, after we had Tymna hit the battlefield, suddenly people were playing green decks remembered, oh wait, my mana dorks can attack too. And that's just a really simple example of overcoming functional fixedness. And now it almost is just, well, they're dorks in a Tymna deck, they're there to attack and occasionally tap for mana.
Right. A lot of those things happen over time too. Functional fixedness isn't something that's overcome by like one person. It's something that somebody will come up with something. You go to the Tyam Discord and you see people doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's like, whoa, I never would have thought of that. Or, you bring an idea to the table and then people are like, that I never would have thought of using that card in this particular way. But that is really interesting and gives me this other idea. And, it snowballs very quickly.
It's almost as if we as human beings cannot keep track of every single card ever printed in the history of this game. But sometimes all it takes is a suggestion from somebody to point out a card that you forgot all about. It's almost like it is a nice big community at the end of the day. Anyway, why don't we go ahead and get back then to focusing in on our clown car. We kind of talked about the strengths of the deck, where really you have a lot of very interchangeable creatures who serve towards a very similar function of trying to essentially turn these into battlefield or into play tutors into our clown cars, as you called them. What other strengths does this deck have?
So I would say in general, it's extremely versatile, and through its versatility, it's very consistent. And what I mean by this is that, kind of like I was alluding to before, there's not any one card that's like, once that hits the battlefield, things are done, and if you can't get it onto the battlefield, then you can't do what you want to do. It's like, okay, you can get Archmage Emeritus onto the battlefield, and anybody who's ever played with one of those on the battlefield realize that if you don't immediately get rid of that, then it's game over. So if somebody then exiles your Archmage Emeritus, that's not the end of the world, because anything else that you get, like, let me go and get my Stormkiln Artist, or let me go and get Gale, Waterdeep Prodigy, it very quickly becomes apparent that, okay, this is a serviceable way to win the game, but if somebody interacts with that, here, I can do this other thing instead, and this will also get me there. And you just need to be kind of aware of what people can do and anticipate the ways that people can interact with you, and make sure that you kind of plan downstream your contingencies. And then you just kind of keep going. And no matter how many things people remove, you just kind of keep on going. So that is its consistency because of how versatile all those pieces are. It's also hard to interact with. Krark and Sakashima itself is notoriously difficult to interact with, because someone casts a spell with Krark, and then the spell is on the stack, and then you've got some Krark triggers on the stack, and then somebody casts a counter spell, and then you come back with a counter spell that puts more Krark triggers above it on the stack, and then people are like, all right, now what the heck should I even be trying to interact with here? And they try to interact with one thing, and then the stack unwinds a little bit, and then they get counter magic back to their hand and then reuse it. And it's one of those things where when you practice under a certain set of presumed constants. Well, they're going to cast their Adnaz, and they're going to have at least one or two spells of cover to protect it. And you're going to need to fight through some number of counter spells to be able to make sure that doesn't resolve. The very, very familiar things that happen all the time that you interact with. If you put somebody in a situation where it's not something that they've prepared, it's not something that they've learned, like there's a lot of times where a certain card, it takes people by surprise, like Magda or Tyann or something like that. And people are like, whoa, okay, I didn't realize it could do that. Now I know, knowing is half the battle, and now I be prepared next time I see that card, how to interact with it. The more you put people in those positions where they have to realize kind of emergently what it is that they need to do that isn't necessarily something they've done a million times before, it is going to elevate the chance that they're going to make a mistake and that it's going to come out in your favor because they're dealing with a circumstance that's not familiar. And due to that, the resiliency of the deck is enhanced because people who are unfamiliar interacting with Krark stacks are going to have a difficulty with that already. But then, you compose that with Sigil Tracer and Dual Caster and some of the little tricks that you can do, especially if you got a Displacer kitten on the battlefield, of how you can manipulate the stack and do things around people's interaction. It's kind of like the drunken master fighting style where people they don't know what to expect, and they're like, I think this is the thing that'll work, and then you do something completely out of left field that they didn't expect, and then those are the biggest things the deck has going for it. It's just unpredictability, difficult to interact with, and just the interchangeability of like everything in the deck.
So if those are the strengths, what would you say are some of the weaknesses of the deck? If someone did want to try out this deck for themselves, what are things they should be going into games with eyes wide open about?
Thing that holds us down the most is mass removal. So toxic deluge, pyroclasm effects, those sorts of things. You don't see pyroclasms as much anymore, but really any mass removal that people generally keep for stacks to disrupt stacks decks is tough for us because we do have kind of an amount of critical mass that we need to get before we can just kind of go. We don't need a ton of critical mass like a stacks deck does, but if we have an established board presence and someone's able to resolve a toxic deluge and just wipe out all of our creatures, then there's some rebuilding that needs to take place, and we don't necessarily bounce back as quickly as some of the faster decks that are going to be in a tournament setting.
Got it. Okay. So essentially, the primary issue you see with the deck as a weakness is that trying to achieve that quote-unquote critical mass relies on creatures. And since it is creature reliant, while the creatures are very much interchangeable in a lot of ways, if you're unable to maintain them on the field while you're trying to get your clown car pulled up, that can be a bad time.
Right. Let's put it this way. Because the clown car is the way to get a board presence when there isn't one. But even when you do that, you need at least to have Krark or some way to make a copy of the spell that you're casting. That's one piece there that you need to have. So either Krark or Sigil Tracer or Dual Caster. And then in addition to that, you need probably some way to make sure that you're solvent as far as resources are concerned. So having a Tavern Scoundrel or a Birdie or a Stormkiln Artist or something like that, a Dockside Extortionist, a way to make sure that you still have availability of mana as you're kind of going through the paces so that you can be able to move your clown car forward, but also be able to cast interaction against people who are trying to disrupt. That's really just like two creatures. So it doesn't take a whole lot to get there, but if somebody wipes out your entire board, then you still need to get back to that spot. You need to have one copier and one thing that helps you stay solvent with resources. So it's not hard to find those, but it's not like you can just turn around and then just play Thassa's Oracle and cast Demonic Consultation and win the way that other decks can.
Right. So how does this deck actually go for its win? So far, you've kind of described the goal of we're going to, out of a single one of greens, into play tutors like Neoform, like Eldritch Evolution. We're going to get a critical mass of creatures into play. How does one translate that into the win?
Generally, the win is going to come from either Gut Shot or End the Festivities, any of the spells that wind up being used for, I'll say, setup or interaction that also double as win cons. Here again, we're seeing some of that interchangeability. End the Festivities is good at any point in the game. In your opening hand, you cast End the Festivities, and you wipe out some number of dorks that are on the battlefield, and maybe an Esper Sentinel or something like that. Once you got Krark on the battlefield, then End the Festivities winds up being able to take out things that are maybe stronger than that, and you're also hitting your opponent. Basically, what winds up happening is you wind up getting into a situation where you're able to cast any spells that you want an arbitrary number of times, and then those spells that themselves aren't maybe necessarily something that people think about as game ending, they wind up becoming game ending.
Just by the sheer volume, right?
Right. People know about Brain Freeze and how it can be used offensively and how it can be used proactively to move your game plan forward for like Underworld Breach, for instance. We don't do Underworld Breach, but we do Gale Waterdeep Prodigy, which winds up being better than Underworld Breach in this context.
Those are some strong words there, Cobble.
Yeah, and I'm saying in this context.
For those who aren't familiar with Gale, I'll quickly read it. Gale is 2 and a blue for a 1/3 legendary creature human wizard with choose a background, which we don't really care about, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may cast up to one target card of the other type from your graveyard. So there's our virtual breach effect. But if a spell cast from your graveyard would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. And thus, as a result of our Krark effects that potentially buy back that card to your hand for 0, you dodge that clause, and yes, in this scenario, this does a very good imitation of Underworld Breach.
And the reason why I say it's better in this context is you don't need to have a certain number of cards in your graveyard. You can have one card in your graveyard and still be able to do this. And you're also able to circumvent timing restrictions. So, for instance, let's say you've got Thrasios on the battlefield and you Neoform him, and you've got Krark who sees the Neoform and then puts another copy. So now I've got 2 Neoforms on the battlefield and Krark sitting there by himself. Now, you resolve the top one, Dual Caster comes onto the battlefield and copies the Neoform and then goes and gets a Sigil Tracer. You tap the Sigil Tracer and the Dual Caster to make another copy, and then go get Spellseeker, which then gets Essence Flux, and then you flicker the Dual Caster and then go and get Gale, and then you have your last one get a Eternal Witness or Veyrin or something like that. Now you can return the instant spell to your hand and then cast that instant spell, and then as a trigger, Gale will say, here's this sorcery spell that you can cast. And you can be doing this, maybe you don't let the Neoform completely wind down and you leave the last one still on the stack, and then you cast a spell while Gale is on the battlefield, and now you can maybe cast a different sorcery as an instant. What winds up happening is a lot of the sorceries that we have, let's say maybe a richer effect than some of the things that are available at instant. So, being able to Twin Flame or do one of the Neoforms or Evolutions or something like that off of an instant spell in response to somebody doing something, it winds up being, again, one, surprising, because people don't expect you to Neoform at instant speed, but also is very flexible to allow you to then say, well, I Neoformed at 3 CMC, but now I need to go and get my Dockside, so I need to reuse the Neoform at a different CMC. So I'll get Gale, and then I'll cast an instant spell, and then cast Neoform again, and then I'll sacrifice my Dragon's Rage Channeler, and then go and get my Dockside, and then continue doing all of the stuff for 2 CMC, and have that second Clown card going. It winds up being very similar to what you can wind up doing with Underworld Breach, but it's on a creature, which is infinitely easier to tutor up, and winds up letting you have fewer cards that are needed to reach that critical mass to go out. If you don't have Brain Freeze and you don't have a wheel or something like that, then going infinite with Underworld Breach is tricky because you need to find a way to keep on throwing cards into your graveyard that you can then exile to be able to pay for the breach costs. In this case, you don't care about any of that. If you have 2 instants and 2 sorceries in your rotation, you can just kind of keep on going, and that's all you need to draw your deck and then cast however many spells you need to kill the table.
Right. Once you're able to get that colored mana generation, it seems like it is very easy to, just keep going. And you've chosen some cards for this particular list that don't see a ton of play in cEDH and may be unfamiliar to people in the more casual end of the format too. So, for example, among the sorceries you've chosen, we have a couple of what almost seem to me to be like mono green cantrips in the forms of cards like Abundant Harvest and Enter the Unknown. So what kind of role do those play in the deck? Because for a lot of people, well, those are just the cards you cast on turn 1 when you couldn't get your 23rd card for a limited deck.
So it's like most of the spells that are in the deck. They serve multiple purposes. Yes, they are. They're green cantrips. But let's look at Enter the Unknown. So Enter the Unknown is 1 green mana. Target creature you control explores. You may play an additional land this turn. You don't see exploring happen very often, but it's, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it in your hand. If not, you can put it back or put it in the graveyard, and you put a +1/+1 on the creature. In this case, let's say that you have a Krark on the battlefield and a Harmonic Prodigy. Now I'm going to cast Enter the Unknown, and I can look at the top card of my deck, and if it's an instant or sorcery that maybe I'll use later, then you just bin it, throw it in the trash, and then you put a +1 on the creature, and then you also have an additional land that you can cast this turn, not cast in play. That winds up being incredibly useful for being able to go out, particularly when you have Quandrix Apprentice. People who are familiar with Krark are very, very familiar with Stormkiln Artist and Archmage Emeritus, because they both have Magecraft. But Quandrix Apprentice is something that most people would have never seen. That's a blue and a green for a creature that's a 2/2, human wizard. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So let's say I've got Krark and a Krark Doubler and Quandrix Apprentice. I can cast a Brainstorm. And now I'll get 2 Magecraft triggers from the cast of Brainstorm. Look at the top 3, see if there are any lands in there. If there's one, here, I'll put it into my hand. Put the rest on the bottom. Look at the top 3. Oh, there's another land. I'll put it into my hand, put them on the bottom. Now, let's see if the Brainstorm resolves. Yes, it does. Okay. 2 more Quandrix Apprentice triggers. So I'll then look at the top 3. Oh, here's a land. Look at the top 3 again. Okay, another land. Put it to my hand. And now I'll actually resolve the Brainstorm, draw 3, and then put 2 back on the top. And one of the cards that I drew was Enter the Unknown. Now I've got 4 land cards in my hand. And I have a spell that gives me additional land drops per turn for every copy that I'm able to make of it. And what winds up happening is you wind up putting all of the lands that are in your deck into your hand. And you put all of the lands that are in your hand onto the battlefield because you're just casting this Enter the Unknown over and over and over again. And yeah, it doesn't let you draw cards other than lands through the Explorer mechanic, but putting those cards into the bin then allows you to reuse them using Gale or Ewit or Noxious Revival or any of those other kinds of spells that we have available to us. So it's card advantage and it's extreme acceleration because you can play an arbitrary number of lands as you get your engine.
It does require quite a bit of setup to have both, specifically Enter the Unknown and Quandrix's Apprentice. But what you seem to be describing is that even absent that scenario, when you've got Krark or Krark doublers and you got Quandrix's Apprentice, it still is essentially giving you a lot of additional value. Even doesn't hit on every single trigger. That's still potentially drawing 2 to 3 extra cards off of a single cast.
Yes. It's very much like a miniature Archmage Emeritus that costs 2, that only lets you draw lands to your hand. That's still card advantage, that's still cards that you're seeing, and that's still lands that you're getting out of your deck, so that when you actually do draw cards, they're very much more often going to be things that you want to be drawing, and you're not pulling a command tower when you're drawing that one card from Thrasios to see if it's going to be the thing that'll let you win. And that's what we want. We want to make all of the card draws that we actually make to be hits, to be cards that we actually want to see.
All right. So you talked about a lot of your favorite cards so far in the deck. Are there any other ones that really just don't see a lot of play in specifically like the cEDH metagame that you think needs some additional discussion?
You might see this in some Krark lists, but it's not universal. Is Narset's Reversal.
I was so excited when that card came out.
Yeah. The thing about Narset's Reversal is, again, this is one of those cards that is very, very ripe for breaking down your functional fixedness. But it's a blue instant, copy target instant or sorcery spell. Doesn't say anything about who controls it. Return that spell to its owner's hand. You may choose new targets for the copy. So it can be used defensively, it can be used offensively, but the biggest thing is that it makes copies. So, because of Magecraft triggering on either cards being cast or copy, what it lets you do, first of all, is to mine more resources out of your Magecraft creatures. And it also lets you circumvent the drawbacks of having bad luck with your Krark flips. So let's say that you've got Krark and Harmonic Prodigy, and you cast your Neoform. Now you've got a Neoform on the stack, plus you've got your Krark triggers, and you don't know if your Krark triggers are going to have to feed something else to your Neoform. You don't want that to happen, so you cast your Narset's Reversal, and you have the one that you cast targeting the Neoform. And then you have the 2 Krark triggers that go up on top of that Narset's Reversal. And either of those 2 might return the Narset's Reversal back to your hand. That's fine, because if either of them winds up making a copy, you have a Krark trigger from the Narset Reversal. Krark trigger then flips in your favor, which creates a copy of Narset's Reversal. And you say, great, that's a copy, so that will trigger your Magecraft. Now, that Narset's Reversal is going to target the original Narset's Reversal if it's still on the stack. So Magecraft triggers again, and you also have Narset's Reversal back in your hand. Now, that new copy of Narset's Reversal, you direct at the Neoform, and then let that resolve. It's going to make a copy of Neoform, trigger Magecraft again, bring Neoform back to your hand, and now you've got Neoform and Narset's Reversal both in your hand, and you still have the Neoform on the stack. And you made 3 extra copies of it through that process because of the unboxing that takes place when you have a Krark trigger that then makes a copy, and then the resolution of the spell that makes a copy and then returns it back to your hand. It's amplifying Krark's buyback as basically doubling the buyback. So that's letting you draw lots of extra cards with Archmage. It's letting you create tons of treasure with Stormkiln. It's letting you just grab all of the lands with Quandrix's Apprentice. Or it's just, letting you protect and hedge against unfortunate Krark flips for the cards that you really want to have resolve on the stack. If the Krark don't flip in your favor for the Narset's reversals, well, then you've got the original card and you can just cast it again.
Oh, that is pretty awesome. When you're describing like that wild pile of triggers going off, it does just make me think of some of the wackiest. I hate to use the word casual decks, but casual decks where you are just like living the dream of I'm going to trigger this, trigger this, trigger this, trigger this, and hope that you have not been drinking very much before that game started.
Yeah. One thing that's really important if you're playing Krark anything is making sure that you're very, very clear about your triggers. And what I actually do is I have a number of physical token cards that represent Krark. So I have like a whole bunch of Krark tokens, a whole bunch of Archmage tokens, a whole bunch of Stormkiln tokens. And when I cast a spell, I put the spell down, and then I put 2 Krark tokens on top of it to represent the Krark triggers as they exist on the stack. And if there's also, Stormkiln on the battlefield, then I put its triggers on the stack too, so that everyone's really clear about what the stack looks like at every moment in time, so that people know what it is that they're interacting with, and you can be very clear so that there's no mistakes and nobody has to call a judge and all of that kind of stuff.
That's just good habit to be in pretty much whenever you're playing a complex deck of how can I try to be as clear as is possible.
And with respect to the casual thing that you were talking about, where you've got a whole bunch of things that are all triggering, and there's like magical Christmas land, and that happens in casual because nobody removes anything, but it doesn't happen in cEDH because people don't let you build a board state. The whole point of this deck is to have a board state in a can. And you start with kind of your bootstrap that you need. You've got like 2 creatures, and then you cast one of any of these spells, and then from that, you create a board state emergently on the spot, and people, if they're not ready for it, then sorry. Now you've got that state where you've kind of got the magical Christmas land that just emerged through not even necessarily casting spells, but just copying them again and again. So when you make copies, the rule of laws aren't going to do anything about that because you're not casting. The people who want to use counter magic, they can use counter magic on the copies that you're making, but you can then just make more copies, and it winds up being really, really hard to disrupt.
So I guess one thing that we should probably do today is also take time to try to walk through how would somebody approach playing this deck for the first time? What kind of things would they want to look for in their decisions for their mulligans and their opening hands? And what should be their starting point, I guess we would say, to set up their clown car? How do they pull that clown car up to the starting line?
For your opening hand, what you really, really want is fast mana and or mana engines. Like if you've got a Tavern Scoundrel in your opening hand, then you're living the good. Some way to generate mana is the most important bit, because you've got Thrasios in the command zone. So if you can make arbitrary mana, then you also have arbitrary card advantage. That said, having a cantrip or 2 is certainly never a bad thing to be able to kind of smooth out your initial draws to make sure you make all of your land drops and make sure that you are finding the things that you need to act on your game plan. And one thing that's really good to pick up kind of as soon as you can is a free spell. What I mean by that is something that doesn't cost mana. So Phyrexian spells are great, or anything like Mog Salvage, Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, and any of those spells that have a rather or without paying in its casting cost that allow you to arbitrarily cast something, especially when you just have a Krark on the battlefield and you don't have a Krark doubler, but you do have, like, let's say you get to a Stormkiln Artist or something like that. Then the Stormkiln Artist only cares that you're casting spells, or Berkey only cares about casting. So if you cast your Mog Salvage targeting one of your own artifacts, and then it gets bounced back to your hand, you're still going to get the mana from your engine. And then you just cast it again, and in those cases, you're actually hoping for your naked Krark to bounce things back rather than actually copy them, because the more that you can have it bounced back, the more resources that you'll be able to pile up, because the spell you're casting isn't costing you any real resources. In the case of the Phyrexian stuff, well, there is that life that is going to become important depending on the texture of the board state who you're playing against. But if I've got Gitaxian Probe in my opener, and I've got some way to generate mana from casting it, then like that's exactly where you want to be. You just kind of get Krark onto the battlefield, and then G Probe for two life, and then you make mana with it, which can then be used to cast the spells that aren't free. But then you're also, when he finally does decide to double it up, you draw some cards, and it's doing all the things that you want. So you're seeing more cards, and you're generating resources, which can then get you more cards. And that's what you want to do.
The instinct of somebody who's picking up this deck for the first time might be to aggressively mulligan for one of those tutors like Neoform or Eldritch Evolution. You would suggest instead you would value a free spell over one of those in your opener.
Most definitely. And even though the deck like explodes out of nowhere, when it's ready to do that, it does that when it's ready to do that. So it's a mid-range deck. It's not going to be racing Rog Silas or any of the other really fast decks. So your posture against those decks should be to be disruptive, interacting with them with counter magic until you've gotten a couple turns in where you've got your bootstrap and you can then kick off a clown car. Or if there's a stacks deck at the table, then like that's the greatest thing in the world, because you're not really hurt that much by the stacks decks, and you can kind of pivot out of the stacks blues that everybody's in, because like I said, you get into a situation where you cast a spell and then you don't cast any more spells, you just copy spells, and most people aren't going to be able to do anything about that if there's a rule of law on the battlefield. So you're going to want to make sure that you are assessing everybody else at the table and kind of building up an expectation of what it is that they're going to be doing. And if they're fast decks, you know that you're not going to race them. So you want to position yourself to be postured for interaction, to be able to disrupt them. And naturally, you'll just accumulate. You don't need to go tutoring for anything specific, because any creature that you get is going to be something that's going to help your gameplay. Really doesn't matter what it is. Oh, it's a Spellseeker. Great. Okay. Oh, it's a Stormkiln. Awesome. Okay. Oh, it's a Dualcaster. Great. But just keep in mind that, oh, okay, somebody, what's the new black and a colorless sorcery?
Beseech the Mirror.
Yes. That looks like a good card to grab, a copy of, and people don't necessarily expect you to Dualcaster it or to Sigil Trace it. And hey, there's lots of things that I have that are for CMC and less. Actually, everything that's in here is for CMC and less. So that's a great thing to just snag from somebody and then just go ham. So you can pivot from a defensive stance very, very quickly and then just run from that point. And if you are kind of savvy about how you do that and you're making good choices about when you take that opportunity, then it winds up being very difficult for people to disrupt it.
Yeah, what you're describing with that almost reminds me of, I'm not sure how many of this episode's listeners are going to recall or have a lot of experience for those few months when Wandering Archaic was the new hotness in cEDH.
That card almost made it into this deck. And sometimes it comes in just because of its interaction with Magecraft. Because one, it's making copies. Two, it's helping you win counterspell wars. Three, it's letting you vicariously make use of other people's spells, all the things. But it is 5 CMC. And it's one of those things that it's for this, for this incarnation, it's just not quite going to get there, especially with kind of the clown car motif. You kind of want to have all of your action kind of huddled around certain CMCs. So having everything at 2, 3, and 4 CMC is what is going to allow you to maximize the explosiveness of one of your clown cars when it goes off. And having disparate cards that are maybe outside of that range, it dilutes that game plan and makes it less consistent.
Yeah, this is such a cool deck. So to our listeners, I got a chance to look at this deck list for a couple of days before we recorded this episode, and I had a lot of fun trying to puzzle out how it worked. I would say the first 10 times I tried just goldfishing this on my own to see how the deck might play, I found myself going, oh no, God, no, Krark is stopping me from accomplishing anything. And it was only after a few days later, Cobble kind of mentioned a couple of things about Twincaster and Sigil Tracer that some of the gears started turning. But quite honestly, I kind of see the deck in a completely different light, just having had a chance to talk with you about it.
Good. And there's a lot of things where people who have played Krark anything kind of know that like naked Krark is not something generally that you want to have. In our case, there's times where it's attractive because you want him to be bouncing your spells back instead of actually letting them resolve so that you can mine resources out of one of the other creatures that you have. But generally, the best practice is you don't want to have a naked Krark on the battlefield unless you have something that can come in and make that a good situation. And generally, the things that make that a good situation are going to be your doublers. So if you don't have a doubler, don't put Krark on the battlefield, is the general best practice.
So do you have any other closing thoughts you want to share? Any elevator pitch you want to give? If somebody's just a little bit curious, what would you want to tell them about this deck, about Clown Car?
I would say that if you like a deck that doesn't have any devoted win cons, and I'll say devoted win cons, where just about any card in the deck can be essentially a win con, and you like to be able to just solve puzzles and take basically any board state and just win kind of out of nowhere. It's very much the antithesis of, I think, what a lot of cEDH is characterized by, where people are like, okay, I've got my Oracle, now I need to go get my demonic consultation, and I need to protect it. And like it's extremely linear from an intellectual point of view, because it's like, this is the thing that I need to go do. And I'm going to go and do that, and then I'm going to execute it. Where this is, there's not any one thing you're really trying to get. You're not even, like we said, you don't really search for any of your neoforms or eldritch evolutions. You're just looking at, okay, what are the pieces that I have? And really just about any pieces that you have can be put together in a way that will get you there. And it's just finding an efficient path through which you can make that happen. Sometimes it's going to be Manamorphose. Sometimes it's going to be using Brainstorm and a Displacer Kitten and Eternal Witness. Or, there's so many different ways that all of these different pieces can be put together that go infinite. They just emerge. It's like, it's not like you're devising them. It's more like you're discovering them as they reveal themselves to you. If that kind of a play style sounds intriguing and perhaps, shall I say, refreshing, as opposed to, I've got my rote game plan that I need to execute on, and it's going to be the same every single time, then this might be a deck you'd be interested in. And hopefully people will take a look.
I definitely think people should take a look at this. One of the common complaints I've had from people who say that this cEDH isn't for me because I don't want to just play the same game plan every time. I play Commander because I want that variety of gameplay experiences. I think that what you're describing here could really scratch that itch for a lot of people. And I know at least one person that I want to recommend this deck to, because I think this could be right up his alley. But Cobble, thank you again so much for joining us for the inaugural episode of Hot Brews on Gemstone Mine. One more time for the folks at home, where can people find you?
Best place is going to be on Twitter. You can find me at Cobblepot with 2 underscores at the end. And really, you'll find me connected to most of the thing the Mine Sculptors are up to. And you can check out my Mox field. And I'm always got at least 20 different decks being brewed at the same time and changing erratically very quickly. So if you're interested, go and take a look. And I'm always up for discussion, suggestions, feedback, challenges, all that kind of stuff.
All right. And you can find us in the comments on YouTube, where we are Gemstone Mine Podcast. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at Gemstone Mine MTG. And you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.